Thank you. You know, I've been in Congress for 16 years. I think it's one of the most intense conversations I've been engaged in. It almost, I was a history major. It took me back to almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we had to decide options on the table, what would be the appropriate response to not just tankers being shot in the Straits of Hormuz, but rather a United States military asset worth about $150 million. So it was very intense. One miscalculation here can lead to a larger war. There were various options on the table. I will tell you, and not to breach any confidentiality, but there were options to strike, particularly the surface-to-air missile vehicle that was used to bring down the United States drone. That was one option. The intelligence community would tell you that if we kill Iranians on Iranian soil, it's only going to galvanize support for the Ayatollah against the United States and Israel. I think the president decided to, not unlike maybe President Kennedy, took a little bit of a step back, took a little bit of a pause to not make a miscalculation and escalate the situation, but rather use a, well, I could say it's reported that cybersecurity operations were used to cripple command and control.
Can you confirm that cyber attacks were indeed launched?
Not if I want to not be prosecuted.
All right, fair enough, had to ask.
But having said that, I think, you know, I'm a little more hawkish. I think Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bolton and I are very like-minded. I think a response is appropriate here, but at the same time, it may have worked out, I think, at the end for the best, because we're using tools we have that doesn't necessarily kill, but does cripple. The president, above all, wants to use diplomacy first, and so Secretary Pompeo is dispatched to the region to get the coalition partners together, and we're seeing that now. Theresa May, they intercepted a tanker bound for Syria, an Iranian tanker,
right,
that stopped them. President Macron in France has condemned their now violation of the JCPOA, which they have effectively done the last couple of days. They are now in violation. So the question is, does Europe want to continue to do business with Iran when they're in violation, you know, of the JCPOA? And I think not. So what the president's trying to do now is to, when he snapped back the sanctions, Mike Pompeo and I never agreed with the JCPOA when we were in the Congress, because it long-term would make sure a certain nuclearized Iran. It also had nothing to do, it didn't address ICBM capabilities, and it didn't address the terror threat. And what essentially happened was $150 billion, and sometimes in cold hard cash on airplanes, being sent to these terror operations. The IRGC, which has now been designated a terrorist organization, which I've stood for many years, but went into their operations to spread throughout the Shia Crescent into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And so I think this diplomatic push to his red line, the president, was clear. His red line is there will not be a nuclear Iran. And if there is, we have 100,000 tons of diplomacy called the USS Lincoln sitting there in the Persian Gulf.
Well, Congressman, to your point, the JCPOA did not, in fact, prevent from getting a nuclear weapon, only delayed it at best. And we know that the president's strategy is to get Tehran back to the negotiating table and come up with a deal that does prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, that does rein in its sponsorship of terrorist proxies around the globe, and that also confronts its intercontinental ballistic missile program. But where we're at right now, do you see Tehran coming to the negotiating table? What kind of timeline do you project? Because so far, the Ayatollah Khamenei has ruled out any kind of diplomacy with the U.S.
Well, and I think the idea of negotiating with the Ayatollah is obviously a challenge at best. But I do think that they are being crippled with the sanctions. I do think we're getting the world community rally behind us now. And I think if we're ever going to get a better deal with Iran, now is the time to do it, along with the threat of military forces. Maximum pressure campaign that's being waged on Iran. What the secretary told me is they are accelerating the process. Under the JCPOA, they'd be guaranteed a nuclear bomb. And I've talked to Prime Minister Netanyahu extensively about this. They would be guaranteed. Now, that is off the table. And now they have a choice to make with the world community. Do they go forward with their nuclear program and ruin their country, or do they stop?
Well, Congressman, when you say the president says a nuclear weapon is the red line, we know that Iran is now starting to march again towards a nuclear weapon. Israel said it never actually stopped with that march, only pretended to under the premise of this deal. So when we say red line, at what point in its march towards a nuclear weapon does the U.S. or Israel, for that matter, consider some kind of preemptive strike?
Well, I think that's a determination the president's going to have to make. I think any issues of war and peace, it is probably the heaviest decisions to be made by the president. You could feel it in the room when we were discussing how to respond to the unmanned aerial vehicle being shot down. That, quite frankly, we were a little surprised because we thought it was high enough in the sky to be protected. But I think it's a discretionary call on the part of the president, but I think he probably made the right move for now, because now we can galvanize support with the coalition partners.
Are you seeing that? Because you do get a sense that perhaps the UK is taking a stronger action against Iran, as you mentioned, by seizing that oil tanker that was in violation of EU sanctions trying to get oil to Syria. Do you perhaps see the UK and the other Europeans, Germany and France, and perhaps the other signatories to the deal, fraying in terms of their consensus, and the UK acting like an ally and supporting the U.S.?
And I think that's the goal, is to dismantle the JCPOA, the Iran deal, once and for all. And that's where it's going.
All right.
And once that document has been put on the ash heap of history, then we have an opportunity to negotiate a better deal with Iran. Otherwise, the military option is very clearly on the table, not one the president would like to make, but let's be honest, this president is not bashful in hitting back. And he certainly will.
Congressman, one of the positive side effects, if you will, of the threat of Iran is that it's brought Israel together with some of the Arab countries in the region. Under the premise of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, you see clandestine relations between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Bahrain. Do you have any insight on just how close those relationships are, how close Israel may be to some kind of formal peace agreement with the Saudis or Bahrain?
This is a very interesting and great historic opportunity between Israel and the Arab nations. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, but I'll never forget in meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu in his office 2 years ago, and I asked him the question point blank, are the Saudis and other Emirate countries allies? And he said yes.
He said yes.
He said
allies of Israel.
I want to work with them because the enemy and my enemy is my friend. And Iran, the enemy. He said, you all are so focused on ISIS, and that's a problem. But he said the bigger threat is the regime of Iran and the threat of the Shia crescents from Iraq, Syria into Lebanon with 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel and out of the Gaza through Hamas and Hezbollah in the north. This Iron Dome cannot sustain this kind of assault. And that's my biggest concern, is they have 150,000 rockets embedded in civilian homes and in schools, such that if Israel responds, they'll be accused of killing innocent civilians.
Well, of course, pointing those rockets is Hezbollah. To your point, there are over 100,000 rockets pointed at Israel. And now, while the Trump administration has successfully tackled Iran's nuclear threat, the U.S. has, in fact, been funding one of Iran's proxy terrorist groups, Hezbollah, for several years. Since 2006, about $1.7 billion of U.S. taxpayer money has been going to Lebanon, to the Lebanese armed forces. Now, granted, the idea behind the money was to counter the influence of Hezbollah, and whilst that may have worked for a while, it seems as though that strategy is no longer working, and a great deal of those funds are now trickling down to Hezbollah. Is it time that U.S. Congress stop sending money to the Lebanese armed forces?
No. No. I think that is something that Congress should be looking at. I met with the head general of the Lebanese forces. He painted a very different picture, but when I go into the classified briefing room, it indicates a very different picture than from what he's telling me. And this is part of that diplomatic game you play where they tell you one thing, but you know from your intelligence reports what the reality is. And as long as there are 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel, I think that assistance is in jeopardy now until they stop that behavior.
Well, another U.S. relationship that perhaps needs to be reevaluated is the one between the U.S. and Turkey, because under President Erdogan, that relationship has become increasingly strained. We know that Turkey has purchased the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, and because of that, delivery of the F-35 fighter jet from the U.S. has been suspended. Turkey, of course, is a NATO ally, but should it still be? Should that relationship be reevaluated? Should Turkey still be a NATO ally?
Well, we have Incirlik military base in Turkey. They are a NATO ally. The chairman, Engel, and I met with the foreign minister of Turkey and the ambassador and said, you know, we let you into NATO because of the Soviet Union threat to Turkey. It makes no sense for you to purchase S-400, capabilities from Russia that actually are in direct contradiction to the F-35. So we passed a resolution in the House condemning Turkey and offering them the Patriot missile as opposed to the S-400, which is Russian. And we are holding up the F-35 sales until they change their behavior. They claim they have purchased this missile system. They still have time to stop this decision. The problem, Michelle, is that they'll be in direct contravention to the U.S. sanctions that were applied against Russia and anybody that buys Russian military. And so the question is a big one, and that would be, imagine a NATO ally being under sanctions for purchasing S-400 out of Russia. That's a course I think Turkey does not want to go down. Being a historic ally, I worry that Erdogan is trying to take Turkey back to the old days of the Ottoman Empire and be this dictator, if you will, of Turkey. He also fights the PKK that we fought with to defeat ISIS and bring down the caliphate. So we have a lot of stress points with Turkey right now, and I'd like to see it resolved.
And Turkey under Erdogan has also become increasingly hostile against Israel. Now, the U.S. and Israel enjoy a very special relationship. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. Israel is the U.S.'s only ally in the Middle East that shares the U.S.'s values. But that relationship, Congressman, is coming under increased scrutiny and open hostility from certain members of Congress. As we heard from Vice President Mike Pence earlier today, that there is anti-Semitism in the halls of Congress. One particular Democratic member of Congress has been very hostile against Israel, has made comments that have been deemed as anti-Semitic, to put it mildly, and has made statements that many see as being openly in support of the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas. Now, you're the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee. What is being done to address it? And should that member still be on that committee? I think we can take that applause as a no. She should not still be on that committee.
Well, ultimately that's a decision for Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Engel. But as for me, I think Omar has to go. And if I can explain that, I mean, that's not for an applause line, but I thank you for that. It's based on history, the history of the committee and the history of this country. I just got back from the 75th anniversary of Normandy. My dad was a World War II veteran. He was part of the D-Day air campaign. I had the opportunity to be there at the 75th, but also had the opportunity to visit Auschwitz to see what they were fighting. And there's nothing more evil than chambers, gas chambers in Auschwitz, and the ovens and the experiments, to see what they were fighting at that time. It's as old as the history books, but we thought it was defeated after World War II, and now we're seeing a rise of this anti-Semitism in Europe. I'm proud my dad bombed the Nazis and bombed Hitler, who was killing the Jews. I'm proud of what that greatest generation did. And I'm also proud of what this committee has traditionally stood for. This committee has always been bipartisan on foreign affairs, but it's also been pro-Israel. And now, for the first time, we have a member on this committee that is not, and is making anti-Semitic comments. And then we have Tlaib and AOC joining in on the chorus against the Jewish people. This cannot stand in the United States of America.
Congressman, with some members of Congress, as you mentioned, questioning the special relationship between the U.S. and ally, and perhaps an indication that there is waning support from for Israel on the Democratic left. The theme of this year's summit is why Israel? Why should I care, and what can I do about it? So I pose that question to you. What do you tell your constituents as to why you support Israel and why the U.S. should continue to support Israel?
Well, I just being a Christian, and my background and my studies, I was raised a Catholic, and I was an altar boy, and I went to Jesuit high school. And in fact, I remember asking my mother, if Jesus was baptized Jewish, why aren't I baptized Jewish? Which is kind of that's a whole other religious debate within my family. But there's a bond that we're tied to Israel and the Jewish people. They are the beacon of hope and democracy in what is a very bad neighborhood.
But it's more than that.
And they are our strongest ally in the Middle East, and we cannot forget that. It's in our national security interest to strongly support them. That's why I introduced the companion version of Senate 1, which was assistance to Israel, $30 billion, assistance to Jordan, the Caesar Civilian Protection Act against Assad, and yes, the BDS movement to support states that it will not buy from countries that are boycotting the state of Israel. So important.
Yes.
And if I could say, Michelle, that is what's called a discharge petition on the House floor. Right now, we have 196 co-sponsors. We need 218. So if you're lobbying on the Hill, we need just about 20 more members of Congress to get on that bill to put it on, to force it against Nancy Pelosi's wishes and force it on the House floor for a vote.
And the name of the bill again, remind us?
It's the companion bill to SB 1.
All right. Congressman, thank you so much. You've laid out a clear agenda of what you'd like some of the people in the audience to do today. Thank you so much for your perspective and for your insight and for having this conversation with us. Appreciate it.
No, thank you, Michelle.
Congressman
Appreciate it.
McCaul.